I'm sorry I'm going to have to leave because I've got a room full of people at the Historical Society, but thank you all for coming. Chris Schulke from the Heritage Preservation Commission. And first of all, I want to thank you all for being here and thank Heritage Preservation Commission member Lois Josephson for her efforts to bring Angela Christie to Fergus Falls. So as you may be aware, the National Trust for Historic Preservation has designated May as Preservation Month. And the Trust has initiated a campaign called This Place Matters that encourages people to celebrate the places that are meaningful to them and their communities. And so through This Place Matters, we hope to encourage and inspire an ongoing dialogue about the importance of place and preservation in our lives. So the Fergus Falls Heritage Preservation Commission has been engaged in similar efforts since its formation. And one of our most effective means in creating public awareness regarding historic preservation is by designating local properties as historic. So beginning May 21st, Tuesday, May 21st at 1 o'clock, we're going to conduct short ceremonies for the 4 most recent properties that have been designated locally historic. And these include the 1914 Christensen House, which is currently owned by Jeff and Deb Zachman. And this house is just a fine example of prairie craftsman style architecture. The second property is the 1873 Page House, which was previously on the National Register of Historic Places, but was delisted when the house was moved out of Fergus Falls in the late 70s. But in recent years, the house was moved back to the community by Father William Gamber. So we're going to recognize that effort. The third property is the 1946 ship, the Eagle ship, as people call it. And this property can best be described as idiosyncratic in structure, mocking the streamlined modern style, as it was built in the how do you like that? Because it was built in the shape and likeness of a seagoing ocean liner. So you should see that.
I want to see this house.
Yeah.
It's not a house, it's a
Bar.
It's a lot.
but it's a unique bar.
Yes, yes, yes.
And another great Minnesota tradition that we're going to recognize locally is Otto the Otter, which is a giant roadside sculpture here in Fergus Falls that was constructed primarily by Fergus Falls High School students in 1972 to commemorate the city's centennial. And again, that's along with this great Minnesota tradition of roadside animals, right? Kind of. So that is very interesting. So again, help us celebrate these designations on Tuesday, May 21st, starting at 1 o'clock at the Deb and Jeff Zachman house. So Angela, who's you next, Lois, to introduce Angela? So thank you very much for coming this evening. Bob?
Your full house is studying
Yeah, fine.
Kirkbride?
Yes, they are actually.
Great.
Students from St. Paul.
Okay. Well, I'm Bob Russell, and I'm an attorney here in Fergus Falls, and it's my honor to introduce Angela Christie, who I have known for quite some time. She's a partner in the law firm of Faegre, Baker, and Daniels, and you're in charge of the real estate practice division.
Just the housing community development.
Housing community development, that's large enough. She devotes much of her practice to housing, and particularly affordable housing and community development. She's been regularly listed as one of the top lawyers in Minnesota in this area, if not in the country. One of her clients said, quoted in a Best Lawyers in America survey, as the strongest person in the state in this area. She has represented not only investors, governmental entities, and developers, but numerous contractors regarding construction documents for housing, office buildings, and other developments. Her principal area of work, as I understand it, is with many layers of financing in the development she's working on. She assists clients in structuring developments to assure the compatibility of various financing sources. She focuses on creating real estate structures that are compatible with the financing. That results in the use of condominiums, townhouses, leasehold cooperatives, vertical plats, use restrictions and easements, and unique subdivisions and plats. Among her honors, she has been named as a top woman in finance in 2009 by Finance and Commerce. Chamber USA named her an American leading lawyer for business and real estate from 2008 to 2017, and I presume 2018. Minnesota super lawyer since 2003, and one of the best lawyers in America. I've gotten to see her almost annually at the Minnesota Real Estate Institute, which is a 2-day event put on in the Twin Cities for people who practice in real estate. And Angela, how long have you been the co-chair of that now? Do you know?
Over 20 years.
Over 20 years. So she's been intimately involved in putting on what is recognized one as the nation's best continuing legal education seminars on real estate. I actually called Jeff, who works at CLE, to try to get some dirt on you, and all he could say was you're the nicest, one of the nicest person he knows, and then we commiserated over the fact that you can put so much into a 24-hour day and we couldn't even come close. So Jeff and I are admirers, and with no further ado, I would introduce to you Angela Christie.
That's way too tall and that's way too much build-up. Because it makes it sound like I have some magic solution for you, and I wish I did, because just having been there, that you have a phenomenal resource. It is a gorgeous facility. Having worked on historic buildings around the country, it's just overwhelming in terms of how pretty, how amazing that facility is. And Lois has shared with me, this all came about as a result of my doing a CLE presentation, teaching some lawyers about the complexities of vertical subdivisions. And she came up to me afterwards and said, "You have to come to my city and talk to people about, how you do this." So all I'm coming with are maybe some tools, and people may have already thought of most of these, but hopefully I can bring a little vision about what we've done on some other properties and how you can split something up into pieces and make it work together and have some flexibility with zoning laws, etc. Having said that, I also like the otter story because my husband's from Jamestown, North Dakota, and as a Boy Scout, he worked on the buffalo in Jamestown. So I have some familiarity with small communities and their animals. So what I wanted to talk about is just a little bit on how you can subdivide a big piece of property like this. And a lot of the lessons come from the Midtown Exchange. If you've been to the Midtown Exchange in the Twin Cities, the old Sears building, it was like 1 million square feet. And so this overwhelming, I think there were 2 or 3 proposals that failed along the way. That, people signed redevelopment contracts with the city and it didn't happen because it's not easy to do this. And some of the visions were less vision than they should have been. But then finally, somebody came in and looked at not taking it as a big retail facility or a big housing facility, but saying, we have to do a bunch of different things with this. And that's sort of when I look at this, I say, probably need to do a bunch of different things with that. And to think a little bit outside the box, because I think when you're looking at a building like this, the way I perceive it is not in terms of a structure or structures that you have to do something with, but as a jigsaw puzzle that you're going to put in place. And a lot of what I do is figuring out how you, from a real estate law perspective, do the jigsaw puzzle. Ways to subdivide property, and I'm preaching to the choir when I've got people from the CDA and others here, but the first thing we think about is a traditional plat. You split property up 2-dimensionally, and my guess is you do some of that here, that you just create parcels and split some of the stuff out. But then life gets a little bit more interesting if you say, well, we're not just going to do that 2-dimensionally. Now all of a sudden we can start thinking in 3 dimensions. Because in Minnesota you've got something called a registered land survey, the ability to split up property in 3 dimensions. So you can start saying, well, is there something, and Lois was saying, maybe those top units, maybe those would be for sale condominiums. And somebody could own those, but then we'd do something below that. And that's exactly what happened at Midtown Exchange. The top floors with the great views, the big units, are for sale condo units. You take the next slice down, that was done with low-income housing tax credits and historic tax credits. And then the global market was done with new market tax credits and historic tax credits. So, and I'll talk a little bit about, part of this is figuring out some of these sources that you use are oil and water together. So that's why you have to start saying, we're going to create different ownership pods in different places, and we're going to start creating different ownership structures so that maybe while we have a for-profit owner, because you need to have the for-profit owner to take advantage of the tax credits, that the general partner of that for-profit owner, and this is a lot of what I do, I represent a lot of nonprofits, the general partner of that partnership is a nonprofit or is an affiliate of a governmental entity. So we get that equity money in to the project over, depending on which program it is, 5, 7, 15 years, and at the end of that time period, the ownership reverts to the local nonprofit or the local non-governmental entity, et cetera. So you figuring out ways that you can pull in resources but not give up local control of your resource. The next thing, I switched around here, I talked vertical subdivision before I talked common interest community. Normally I prefer vertical subdivisions over common interest communities. This might be one where, as we dug into it, it might be one where a condominium might be the better option. In part because there's some building code changes, and it would depend in part whether those were in place before you did this, which would work. But a condominium, people think of them as individual residential units. In my projects, when we do condominiums, they are big pods. So your residential rental project, 100 units maybe, would be condominium unit 1. And the global market would be condominium unit 2. So all of a sudden you start getting the vision with this thing, and I'm going to go grab the picture because I like the visual. All of a sudden, as you start thinking, you could say, well, it's my understanding you've got somebody that's interested in these two ends. Maybe all of a sudden they become condominium units 1 and 2. Or maybe you want to continue the numbering so they're 1 and 20, depending on how many pieces you want to divvy this up into. And then what, either through a vertical subdivision declaration or a condominium declaration, you end up creating a community where you define maintenance responsibilities, how the utilities work, who pays for what. The other advantage of that is that the building code has exceptions, and architects can give you far more detail than I can, but the building code has exceptions when you have a condominium plat in terms of setback and party walls and firewalls that make it much, much more flexible. I had one project in St. Paul that we were going to do a vertical subdivision, and then somebody new came in to the building department and decided that all of those rules regarding separation applied to a vertical subdivision but did not apply to a condominium. It had an $800,000 difference on the project in terms of the cost of construction between calling it a vertical subdivision and calling it a condominium. As I say, there are some building code changes that may say vertical subdivisions are treated the same, but they aren't in place yet. So until then, costs that you may have to incur by saying somebody's going to own these top floors and we're going to sell them off to somebody to do for sale condominium development, and then this is going to be an apartment building, and I'm just picking up Lois's ideas here, this is going to be a hotel, and this is going to be a healthcare facility, whatever, that you can all of a sudden start saying, let's split it up into pieces, and then we could offer somebody, you could buy unit 1, or you could buy unit 1 and 2, or 1, 2, and 3. So split it up into pieces and give developers a little bit more of an option about how you are going to parse this down into palatable portions for somebody to consume, as opposed to looking at this and saying, we don't have the resources, we don't have the capabilities, we can't do this whole thing at once. Another thing I've used on some projects is the concept of leases, long-term leases, so a 99-year lease. Minnesota has a sort of weird problem with its condominium statute in that, and we might be able to avoid it on this one, but if you're doing new construction or a building that doesn't have mechanical systems in place, unfortunately Minnesota's condominium statute says you can't file a condominium plat until the building and all I want to say components. It's basically mechanical systems serving more than one unit have to be in place. So all of a sudden, you're forced with what would be a really neat way of subdividing this up front into condominium units may not be available just because of the difficulty with the statute. Now I'm going to do one other thing that's, I've done it once. We did once sort of do it that we called it an air condominium and didn't envision the components, the mechanical systems being in place. And the local municipality and recorder let us record the condo declaration. What I'm saying is just thinking outside the box sometimes. But what we've done on projects where we can't do the condominium up front is that we have used air rights leases. Good example here is Dorothy Day, if you've been downtown St. Paul. Phase 1 is a shelter on the bottom and tax credit housing above. This was done with new market tax credits. This is done with low-income housing tax credits. You can't mix the two. But by using a 99-year lease of the upper floors to the tax credit partnership with a provision in there that said we were going to file a condominium when it was completed, we were able to do it. Similarly, Dorothy Day 2 is a service center with low-income housing tax credit above New Market's low-income housing tax credits. So taking all of the tools that you've got, historic credits, New Market's credits, low-income credits, figuring out, you know, what you can, how you can combine them and what resources there are. And so then talking about some of those resources. Low-income housing tax credits, it sounds like you've already got somebody interested, but that's basically a 10-year program. It's either a 9% credit over the 10 years or a 4% credit, but it's weird because the 4% isn't really 4%, it's about 3.3 right now. It floats, the 9% doesn't. It's Congress, don't ask me to explain why. But if you can do a 9% credit project with historic credits, which you can combine those two, if you think about somebody, you know, an investor coming into a deal, getting 9% credits each year for 10 years, plus they get the depreciation, hurt a little bit by the latest tax act in terms of the reduction in corporate rates, but still, there's a benefit there. And they get the 20% credit, federal credit on rehab costs, plus you get a 20% state credit on rehab costs. You don't have to have a whole lot of, you know, personal equity or loans into the deal to make a low-income housing historic deal work in terms of cost.
Yeah. Just a note on our, for the 9% credits, Greater Minnesota is very, not at an advantage to get that allocation of 9% tax credits just because of some of the criteria that Minnesota Housing looks at.
It is competitive and there is a point structure.
Right, around, you know, some of the key ones are around fixed route transit, some others, I mean, the fixed route transit one is the one that really hurts, and then some others as well. So just as a note, it's very difficult for Greater Minnesota to tap into 9% tax credits.
But I could put you in touch with Southwest Minnesota Housing Partnership, which is a client which regularly gets a couple of allocations a year.
Yeah, well, because we haven't looked at them, we're not geared up to address some of the other point structures, so some of the homelessness and, you know, we need to get there. I mentioned we're having this housing workshop next week locally, so, you know, hopefully those will be some of the topics that we'll talk about there.
It's
as
competitive,
well.
but as I
Yeah,
say, there are
but
some
looking at
people I
some of
could put you in
those-
touch
yeah.
with in
Yeah.
terms of potentially saying there are some people in Greater Minnesota.
Right, not saying it doesn't happen, but that we're at it, and because we haven't been thinking about that here, there's some components that we can do to improve future applications, but right now we
And go down and testify when they're doing the hearings on the qualified allocation plans, and yeah, there are a variety of things. I do most of the housing tax credit deals in Indian country around the United States, and that has been a challenge in terms of getting, I mean, California had similar proximity to a grocery store, proximity to, you know, and it's like, no,
Yeah.
but that's sort of why we need to do this housing, because they don't have proximity to any of this stuff. And 3 years ago, we did our first, we got our first allocation, and now we're getting a few a year. But yeah, I'm not saying this is easy. I'm not saying it's a given, but I guess what I'm just saying is that there's tools out there that it sort of surprises me that some developers haven't come to you and said, you know, how about if we took this piece? And it sounds like that may be happening now, that you have somebody, are they looking at doing a 4% or a 9% deal?
4% based on our
Okay.
conversations, yep, and review at this point, and then historic
Yeah.
layering. Yeah.
And even with the, 30% present value, low income, and the 2 historics, that's a lot of subsidy for a project. My guess is it's gonna take a lot of rehab, but the good news is that the historic credit is based on the amount of rehab, and it doesn't sound like you're gonna be doing a lot of stuff that's ineligible. So, I've talked a little bit about ownership requirements. As I say, financing requirements, part of it is just splitting things up so that incompatible things don't go together. Zoning and land use, the advantages of having a condominium and getting around some of those building code issues. I don't know what you've been talking about with the current developer that's proposing, how you're gonna split up the land and where your mechanical systems are and, but that's what typically a condo declaration would address, is everything from parking to HVAC systems, to maintenance of the roof, to access through the building, life safety systems, how do you get to the exits and entrances, and in some ways it's one of the most fun things I get to draft, because you get to sort of live the building and figure out how it's going to work. Even more fun for me right now is I'm working on the Mill City Museum building, and I worked on that close to 20 years ago and had to think about how it was going to work. And interestingly enough, now coming back 20 years later, we're redoing the condominium declaration, in part because the condominium declaration says that all of the utilities are separately metered, and they value engineered that out of the construction during the construction, so they aren't separately metered, and have sort of been limping along figuring out who has to pay what between the museum and the various, the floors are sliced up with various owners, the architect on the top floor and McKnight Foundation and, various owners of the various pieces. But again, that was a way with a historic property of having GO bond funds on the bottom 3 floors, which normally are death for any other kind of project, because they have a declaration that's filed in perpetuity that says it has to be governmentally owned. And so worked with the state and said, yeah, but that only applies to floors 1, 2, and 3. And then we can have a tax credit partnership do the historic development on the upper floors. In redoing the condominium, go back to the state, make sure that we're not doing anything that would make it that the museum property, the museum is not able to use bonds on its property while being able to use other private funding, bank funding by people to buy and sell the condominium units above that are office retail with gorgeous views of the Mississippi. So I mean, that's sort of the message. I don't have any magic bullets for you, and it sounds like you've thought about a lot of these things before. But Lois said, come to us and talk to us about how you can slice and dice real estate. And it's one of my favorite things to do, is to figure out how you can take two what would appear to be incompatible purposes, or a building that is wonderful but isn't being used, and figure out ways to have a variety of players come to the table and make it work.
On a historic tax credit project, let's say you have a segment that is fully owned by one person, one party, one investment group, and they want to develop the project floor by floor. Now, all of the floors will qualify for tax credits, but they want to be able to finish a floor, have that credit begin to roll and get the benefit of it, and do another floor. And it is our understanding from talking with the historical parties that that's a doable thing and happens with some regularity, but would love to talk with
You could do
somebody.
a phased project, and a phased project I think gives you up to 60 months to do the building.
Okay.
And to tack onto the existing. You have to have a plan for the overall renovation, so you can't just sort of say, we're going to do this and then figure it. So you sort of have to have at least rough architectural plans for the whole thing and get those approved. There's the risk, obviously, if you did floor 1, but what you did to floors 2 through 5 weren't approved by SHPO and Interior, you're not going to get your credit. So you do have to. Commerce Building in downtown St. Paul was that. We did a low-income housing tax credit project. Because of the limitations on size, you can only get so many credits allocated in a year. We did phase 1 as sort of the bottom half, and then phase 2 as the top half. and did it all within a 60-month period. Huh?
I lived there. I was the first
Yay!
person to move in. Yeah, it was an awesome building.
Yeah, it's a fun building. And so that was one of my children.
It was beautiful, yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, there are a lot, I could spend hours talking about the complexities and which, how you do this program, what's ineligible basis. Historic ends up being a little bit more complicated because for sale condos aren't going to be in your eligible basis generally. So with the Sears building, the top floors were not in basis, but people were willing to pay pretty high prices for those units because they were nice and they had gorgeous views of downtown. If you walk around the building, you'll realize that you don't get this feel, but there are separate entrances. The building, although it's a single building, really feels like different buildings. I mean, a lot of this, you can make it work. One example I had once, I was, the original city of Minneapolis, who knows where Serdix is in downtown Minneapolis? The original city of Minneapolis was that building that's kitty-cornered to Serdix. It's Terracino Coffee, and it's now, I don't remember, it was Babino. It was Babino, and now it's some other fancy name restaurant, but there's affordable housing upstairs there. And I was eating at Babino's and said to the night manager something about the housing above. She says, people live there? So a properly designed project, people say, oh, we can't have that next to that, or you can do luxury hotels and affordable housing and, in a single project and make it all work together. There are a lot of good examples of that. Another great example is kitty corner from the Guthrie, the building that has Kindy, Thai, and Ticketmaster in it. That's an affordable housing project. Located kitty corner to the Guthrie. What was done there was it wraps a parking ramp, ugly parking ramp. Housing was built around the parking ramp. The other thing I told Lois, that another passion of mine right now is autonomous vehicles and talking about autonomous vehicles. And when we were up there, she's saying, we built a parking ramp. I said, wait a second, think twice about how many parking ramps you build, because I'm saying now, parking ramps should be repurposable. If you're going to do something that's a parking ramp, it's going to be a parking ramp maybe for 15 years. But I really think, now maybe not as much in Fergus Falls, but I think even in greater Minnesota, you're going to have fleet vehicles.
Yeah, and we've seen there's been sessions around about how it may actually impact greater Minnesota more than some of the urban areas in some ways, just with providing transportation options that, with mass transit not being as available and things like that, that's going to have a totally different impact in greater Minnesota. But
yeah, and nobody knows exactly what yet. I mean, I think it's first going to come with fleet vehicles for transportation, for replacing the trucks.
Yeah.
That's what we're going to see first. But it's also, when Lois said, we'll build a parking ramp, I sort of said, only if you can turn it into something else. So it's a lot of that. And I can't tell you what to do with your community. I don't know enough about your community. I've been trying to ask people questions about what do you need and what can you do. And but what you really need is to have a flexible enough plan that you can have developers come in and say, I'd really like that. I think I can do something with that piece. And hopefully, we can create enough energy. I did contact the executive director of Southwest Minnesota in partnership. He says, Angela, I'm retiring at the end of the year. It's like, no, Rick, because they have done something in Alexandria. But
question. So,
yeah.
In your experience, when you've done vertical platting,
yeah.
Do you have to have the entire, on a complex that size, do you have to have the entire thing scoped out, or do you run the risk of?
You can amend it later. I mean, you can split it this way, and you could say, I'm going to take from here over. I'm going to call this lot 1, I'm going to call that lot 2, and I am going to, now it gets a little bit more interesting since you have somebody interested in the two ends. Yeah. But you could say, that's lot 1, that's lot 2, and this is outlot A. And we're going to keep the flexibility of creating outlot A into other subdivisions. You can split it this way initially, and then start taking pieces down. Outlots, as people in zoning and planning, they're not separately developable until platted as lots. So you can create some outlots and say, these are the things we're going to subdivide later. You can do a condominium where you have potential for additional property. In fact, with the Mill City Museum, they had that and they never got around to adding the additional property, so there were some functional parts of the museum that weren't part of the condo. We're fixing that too. Because they had additional property down by the river that were a couple of old buildings outside the wall, but right here, served by the HVAC, at least now, and they're using as a theater down here, but never thought about bringing it into the condominium structure and how it had a right to be using those utilities or how it was paying for them. Those things can be remedied, but you can have sort of use your imagination how you want to split it up. We want to do this now, we want to do this later, we want to do this and this, we want to do this, and then we're going to split this one into 3 stories. Basically take your Legos and think about what you want, and then leave this, this part's still in the box. This is your little Lego plate that doesn't have anything on it yet for future development. So you can basically do, subject to obviously your land use people in the city saying, yeah, we think that's okay. But legally, there's a lot of flexibility. Yes, Bob?
Angela, you mentioned the problem with the condos. That's a uniform law. Have other states adopted things to get around the provisions of the uniform law?
Some states do not have a provision that you have to have it completed
Okay.
before you build it. We have not done that. We are working on one thing right now and I think it's going to go through in this legislative session. There are some anomalies in the Uniform Act that talk about it applying to residential condos. And I think we are going to get something in that says if you do this big box of 100 units that are all rental units, that's not residential housing. There are some rules regarding reserves and how the association runs and consumer protection that are really geared to all those people that are buying that the statute doesn't work really well for. And we're fixing some of that this session, but have not convinced Tom Bray to take on the other. And the risk is, here's the reason it's in there, is because some less than reputable developers may have been known in the past in some states to sell condo units to people that don't have HVAC, that don't have, it's not a functioning unit and people buy them. And you prohibit that by saying, you haven't created the parcels. You can't convey me unit 1 until you have an architect sign off that says unit 1 is finished and works. So there's a reasonable consumer protection reason for it. It just makes it a little difficult to do these creative condos. But
That issue wouldn't exist for an existing structure.
it may not exist for an existing structure. We'd have to talk to architect about, And I think people would be more flexible about letting folks sign off and letting it, if it weren't, we might not do the individual for sale condos. You might do that as condo unit 1 and then superimpose another condo on that.
Okay.
You can have a master condo and then sub-condos. And so you could have, say, we're not going to split up those top floors into individual condominium units until they have plumbing, heating, air conditioning. But we could split it up and say, developer A, if you want to buy this and sign a redevelopment contract with the city that says you promise to do X and you're posting this letter of credit and you're doing, and we'll sell you that top slice subject to certain promises, and then when you get it done, then you file your condominium declaration splitting that up into individual condominium units. I could see that folks would be more flexible saying that the big pods had their mechanical systems in place.
The city has already done a vertical. The American Federal Bank, the parking lot is owned by the city, correct? And the bank, the 2-story bank is owned by the bank. That was done probably 15 years ago.
An RLS?
Huh?
An RLS, yeah.
We're way ahead of the times.
You are. No, it's a wonderful community.
Angela, as you were talking, you made reference to low-income housing several times. How are you defining low-income housing? What are the percentiles of type of housing that fit into?
Well, it sort of fits into this, what do you need to get the points to be able to get the credits? If you're doing 4% deals, then basically you can do them at 60% of median income. And my guess, 60% of median income in this community is workforce housing.
Is what?
Workforce. You know, we're talking about the people that are working. I mean, that's what Southwest Minnesota Housing does a lot of, is, you know, even for entry-level teachers, people working in your retail, 60% of median income, I don't know what your median is, but generally, it's really darn close to market rate rents.
It is close, yeah, at 60.
What about the 9 points?
The 9%, you're going to have to make certain promises to Minnesota Housing to do some lower income units. And it sort of depends on what their qualified allocation plan is from time to time. Right now, most of my projects have 4 homeless units in them, which
For how many units?
I just did one we just closed one in Maple Grove, and it was 4 out of 50 in Maple Grove. And there you need to come up with a service provider, and I mean, the theory there being that if you have homeless individuals integrated into basically a market rate project and provide the services, and you can talk a lot of the nonprofit and for-profit developer clients that I represent, that this has worked in most of them, that if you bring in a few homeless units and you provide services to people and you stabilize, that they're not homeless units anymore.
What happens in that regard, comparison-wise, of veteran housing, student housing, artist housing, employee housing? And
Boy,
those
you
are-
just came up with 4 different answers under the tax credit rules. Veterans housing, I think, works. At least I've done a number of them, so it better. In the last tax act, they tried taking out artists and putting in veterans, which made me a little bit nervous because it seemed to infer that veterans weren't allowed to be a preference before. And I had gotten a letter from HUD saying that veterans were allowed to be a preference under fair housing. You're not allowed to do employment-based, but I don't think having, at some point in your life, having worked for the military, in part because I'm being a military brat, but in part, you know, that would should disqualify for you from housing. And down on the VA site in South Minneapolis, I've done 2 projects. I'm doing one in Las Vegas right now for vets. So veterans housing, I think, works. Have been told that we've largely solved the problem of homeless vets in Minnesota, at least as to those folks that want housing. In terms of students, generally no. You can't do student housing with low-income housing tax credits. There are a few exceptions. Married students, did that on the Standing Rock Reservation. Single moms, or single parents. Most of the, you know, doing a project for Jeremiah right now, that's a lot of single moms. So there are some exceptions. People just got a new one into the federal law that's kids coming out of the foster care system, because that was such a problem. They just get dumped on the street. And people in job training programs. So certain students, but generally student housing. Ask me afterward as to how the student exception came about. It's a great insight into the mind of Congress and why we don't do why with what Congress does. So students, veterans, what were your other? Artists. Arts-based did get a provision into the federal law that says you can give preference to artists.
So if a building began as an artist-supported entity, and veterans are validly supported also, and married students are validly supported also, are those freely interchangeable when it comes to renting those units?
It sort of depends what you want to do. I mean, it's going to be who you're saying you're giving preference to. In general, the low-income housing tax credit says it has to be for general public use. And the way that that's determined is by federal laws on fair housing. So if for some reason you're violating fair housing laws, I have a special way doing projects on Indian reservations that I have some federal guidance on. But you generally, your preferences have to be consistent with fair housing law. And that was one question the IRS and some were raising about artists. And so federal law changed. You can have preference for artists. But you could not have a major employer in town come in and say, this is going to be for my employees. Or you couldn't have the Rotary Club say, this is going to be for current and former Rotary Club members. That's specifically prohibited by the federal law. But you can have, and we have had employers that had desperate housing needs in a community, that they have employees that are traveling 30 or 40 miles to get to the plant, provide subsidy to a project. You can't promise you're going to give preference to their employees, but since they employ a lot of people in town, if you create housing, it creates opportunities for housing for, their employees. Now, it sounds like you might be slightly different in terms of where you are in terms of housing and employment needs. And that's why I say I can't tell you what to do, because it really is what your community needs. But there are ways to spin things to try to make them work. You can't always.
Is there any added flexibility by the city owning and leasing? Do you pick up any programs with municipal involvement?
I mean, it's going to have to be a long-term lease to be a tax credit project.
I understand.
On Indian country, we do 50, 60-year leases from the tribe because we can't own. One other thing I didn't throw out here, just as you're thinking about this tax credit, have you talked at all about community service facilities? Because I hear this is in a qualified census tract. And one of the things that's sort of neat that got changed in the Internal Revenue Code, sort of as background, had a project, Anishinaabe-Waukegan, right on Franklin Avenue in Minneapolis. And they had a basement that wasn't being used, and they asked me, could they fix it up. They had some private money they could use to let the homeless people come in and take showers and hang out during the day. And I had to say no originally, because it used to be that any facilities financed with tax credits had to be exclusively for use of the tenants. If you're in a qualified census tract now, you can do something called a community service facility, which is pretty darn broad. We have done everything from child care facilities to community gymnasiums on Indian reservations and service centers. So lots of different things you can do, and that qualifies, subject to certain limitations, for the low-income housing tax credit. So all of a sudden, you can do some community stuff.
How would the ownership be structured?
It would be owned by the partnership,
Yeah, okay,
but they could lease it
yeah.
to, so we have I know in Rochester, Salvation Army, medical clinic, dental clinic, it has to be primarily for use by low-income residents in the community. And it has to be, you have to basically do a market study that says you need it. But if it's something that you could say based on the, facilities, affordable daycare or, early childhood education, or think about stuff you need, that particularly if you get a 9% credit deal, proves to be a pretty powerful tool.
Sorry, I'm just trying to understand that. So it's as part of a housing project? or-
Yes, it's as part of a housing project. It would be owned by the developer of so you'd form a limited partnership.
Yeah.
Say the limited partnership has XYZ nonprofit, or
As the general partner?
as the general
As-
partner, or an affiliate of the city as the general partner, or the Fergus Falls HRA, which I've done some work for, as the general partner. So you'd have something that would be controlling, you're gonna end up in these deals with a 99.99% limited partner coming in. So you're gonna have US Bank, Wells Fargo, Enterprise, National Equity Fund, somebody coming in that takes 99.9% of the deal, but they don't control it. They have powers to remove the general partner and to make certain decisions if things aren't going right. But in general, it's this general partner that runs the deal. So it's going to feel like, absent something going wrong, the nonprofit or the affiliate of the city owns and runs this facility. And there's a really neat provision in the Internal Revenue Code that says if this general partner is a nonprofit or a governmental entity, that at the end of the 15-year tax credit compliance period, by assuming the debt that's on the project and paying any tax liability that the limited partners have for getting out of the deal, can acquire the deal. And usually, in most deals right now, there's no exit tax liability. There might be on some 4% deals, but usually with the prices that are going on right now, there's no exit tax. So at the end of 15 years, you wave bye-bye. And some limited partners are even more susceptible to being willing to get out. National Equity Fund, Enterprise Social Investment Corporation have, they're investors, but they have general partners that are nonprofits. And in those deals, they typically, at the end of the 15 years, say, here's, for $1, you can have my interest. And they walk away from the deal. So they put millions into the deal, but they don't expect anything. They really don't expect cash flow other than sort of some nominal payment to pay their administrative costs for the 15 years they're in. They don't expect to get any appreciation or back end out of the deal. What they're getting are the credits and the depreciation, and they walk. So that's sort of the beauty of it, is you get millions of dollars of free money. A little trickier with a historic credit and how you structure that. It's nicer when you can structure it with the low income and the historic, because you can do a little bit more in terms of that exit tax. The exit strategy, you don't quite have the same exit strategy for historic because it's not built into the code, but usually we figure out ways to structure deals that we're pretty darn confident that for a nominal payment the investor will get out, particularly if it's an investor that you're comfortable with. Your community bank, that if they tried to extract something at the end of 5 years, would not go down well in the community. Other questions?
What
I'm confident Lois will call me when she has them, so.
What are the breadth of veterans funding sources that you're cognizant of? Is there anything other than HUD veteran funding?
Well, there's the HUD VASH. There's like a Section 8 program for vets. The leverage we used on the veterans site was we entered into an enhanced use lease with the Veterans Administration because they owned the property. So we got a really good deal on the land, basically free, if we offered to give preference to veterans. But other than that, no, it's just, it's like other affordable housing that.
There's nothing market rate for veterans.
Not that I know of.
If a community.
Because if it's market rate, they don't get me involved because it's not complicated.
Okay. What's the definition of community interest? If your community interest is to draw technically capable people to your community, and you were to and provide workforce support, but you're interested in technically capable people. Does that begin to merge into how far can you stretch the definition of community interest?
And I'm not sure where the definition of community interest comes in.
So
I don't have any program that is tied to, community interest to me is more what creates the vision.
right, but you talked about being able to incorporate components of the project.
Community service facility.
Community service facilities, right? Okay.
Yeah.
So it was community services.
And that's more the need for the function
Right.
as opposed to the interest.
Okay, so if there's a need for the function of technical people, just like there's a need for the function of daycare.
If you had thinking outside the box, haven't done this exact thing before, although Common Bond does, what do they call it, advantage centers in their projects. And their advantage centers are training centers, computer centers, latchkey for kids. I would think if you said the low-income community in this area needs a center for affordable computer training, for affordable, what you were looking at doing was growing a
Affordable major
population.
spaces, affordable community kitchens,
Community kitchens,
affordable-
community
and
kitchens.
and not community kitchens from a feed-you perspective, but a community kitchen from the perspective of start your product.
If you had job training, workforce training for what you needed in the community, and you were bringing in low-income persons, which, as I said, I think in your community at 60% is going to be a lot of people that need training. Project I just closed in St. Paul, we got a bunch of city funding, and this EDA might know more, I'd never used these funds before, that were to lower rents and to hire low-income persons. It's in the Rondo neighborhood, and the first floor One of them's going to be a jazz club, and the other's going to be coffee shop and workspace. And we made promises about hiring low-income community persons and providing affordable rents to small businesses, and got well in excess of $1 million to finish the first floor of that project, because the commercial is generally harder to figure out how to fund. And the city of St. Paul had, and I can certainly give you the names of those programs, so they say, I just hadn't worked with them before, but learned a lot of new rules about how to finance, and again, splitting that up and down, because this is, and that was with a long-term lease. Rondo Community Land Trust is doing the first floor tax credit partnership, where they teamed up with an experienced tax credit developer, is doing the upper floors.
Otter County happens to have more veterans than any other county in the state of Minnesota. And so I don't know.
Per capita or by number?
By number, I think.
Hmm.
And so from the perspective of being able to create a public face of a cool environmental county in which to live, and a positive support system for people who've had that similar experience, we should be well positioned. And veterans come with lots of, especially our current folks, lots of technology skill sets and wonderful things to have available for a workforce.
And lots of traumatic brain injury
Right.
issues, so,
Right
you
now,
know.
we have like 50 homeless vets.
Right.
So you haven't solved the problem.
Huh?
I mean, the state's saying that was their priority.
Yeah. No, we haven't solved the problem. We have 50 in the county.
That's how potentially you could get some tax credits if, you know,
Yeah, I mean, the.
homeless vets, homeless youth are
that's-
priorities.
There are homeless units in the proposal right now.
Okay.
But do they have to be senior in age?
Veterans, disabled, and senior is the targeted population.
Oh, so it is that broad, it's not just senior? Okay.
No, they plan, one building will likely be senior, and then the other would be mixed. Veterans, disabled, probably not family units, just given the space
Mhm.
that it is, so, yeah.
Okay.
But Common Bond did a homeless vets project down on Fort Snelling, and Community Housing Development Corporation has done the two on the VA site. And then Accessible Space, which is a national nonprofit that does stuff with people with disabilities. I'm working on their second or third project in Nevada for vets, so I could put you in touch with any of the above that could talk about, you know, how they're doing that.
I have to get a kid at school, so please.
That's important.
Well, so is the Kirkbride.
How old's the kid?
7. That's what I'm gonna pick up. We have 5 of them.
Does he know which one he's going to pick up?
Yeah.
Yeah. Whichever one shows up at the door.
I'll get one of them.
Have fun with them. I view it as very important that you spend time with the kids.
Absolutely.
I have two, and
As
they
far as
remember.
the retail minority-owned businesses or women-owned businesses, did you ever use any of those?
Oh, thank you, thank you. And as I say, if you guys have questions, this is a passion, so. Women and minority-owned businesses? I mean, at least, where I run into that more than anything is as requirements in the municipalities I deal with in terms of requirements. I don't know, and again, I don't do a lot of sort of the dig down deep on the commercial in terms of the resources that are available. I mean, SBA lending, you know, 504 stuff, some of that you might be able to get some subsidies for. I don't know that there's a whole lot for the construction end of it, but there might be some for financing if what you did was, your vision was small pods of businesses that would service whatever your bigger vision is there. So if what you're thinking is hotel and all these people, and you said, we should have a coffee shop, we should have a beauty shop, we should have a, you know, and you designed first floor to have nice little retail spaces that people could easily finance, I mean, that's the best thing I've seen, but there may be other pots of money out there. And that's where I go to people like the EDA and say, nope, any money?
Not a lot.
There's not a lot for commercial, as I say. I was surprised by this other pot of money.
Yeah.
So I have a question. Does the city, I'm on the planning commission, I've been on it for a year and a half now, so I'm fairly new to all of this. But does the city split it up and plat it out first and then do a call for developers, or how does that process work?
You have a couple of options. You could see, and it sounds like you haven't had a lot of appetite for a master developer, but you could see if you indicated a willingness of the city to have somebody take all or a portion. You could work with somebody and you might have a master developer that wanted half of it, and the city could retain the other half, or you could, as the city, split it up, based on conversations with your current potential developer. Because you're gonna have to do something with it in terms of subdividing it to make it work for those folks.
Yeah, that process is underway.
So
Of subdividing it already? Okay.
And what are they envisioning in terms of tying into the bigger parcel?
Right, well, there's a couple areas, and because it's on the end, it does make it a little makes it simpler than, versus like, say it was the tower, that would be a very different, more complex conversation, but with the end, it's looking like to be a relatively traditional plat.
Okay.
With planning for what, because we're in such a limbo situation, I'm sure Andrew brought you up to some of the site.
We didn't
No?
get too much
Okay.
into it.
We didn't get into the weeds on that.
Okay. But we'll be, trying to utilize some of the existing covered ground area for their parking, and so it's looking at those areas. kind of
And they
some of
could
the
be
existing
relatively
conditions.
standalone if they put in their own HVAC.
And they would be, that, because of the timing, they would be doing those systems on their own, so, that's the thought, is it's going pretty traditional.
And then the question are just, are there any retained easements you want to keep on the property in terms of sidewalk, bike
Yep.
path,
Yeah.
what do you retain, what do you,
is there anything lost by those end units not being part of a more cohesive full plan?
not if you can retain some flexibility with the developer to make sure that you have all of your ingress, egress, all of that going on. I'd also want to just double check with SHPO that there was, no adverse impact on the overall historic character.
They're closely integrated in the discussions. They were
I
up
think-
a month ago. They came to visit even, versus just looking at floor plans.
Making sure that taking those off didn't somehow impact your flexibility of historic development of the rest, but
Yep.
as long as
And
they
it
think
did
they're
provide
separable.
They, as far as where the entrances will be, and, they were initially standalone buildings, but their entrance, one of them, at least one, was where the connector hallway was then built, so having to figure out where is the main entrance going to be,
Yeah.
and so they're in the discussions on all those.
And the developer just earlier this week reiterated again the desire to be collaborative with future uses. So everything we talk about doesn't seem like it's going to be much of a roadblock for this development group to get on board with.
I've got a grain elevator head house that's going to be an entrance, joint entrance for a tax credit and a non-tax credit project down in Minneapolis that's going to have bike repair facility in the basement, bike storage in the basement, and community rooms in the upper floors. And so, as I say, you can take basically anything and turn it into reusable space if you have people that have vision. It sounds like fortunate you've got somebody that. So, if any of you want to talk to me after this, I'll stick around for a bit, but nice meeting you.
Thank you very much.